Hi grade 2s, welcome back from half term. As you know, we're going to be continuing a lot of stuff online, mainly because all of you have done so well and you will always be able to keep rewinding back through the videos so you can move at your own speed. You never have to worry that things are moving too quickly or too slowly. You can move at your pace. And as we're getting into our new half term, let's get onto some slightly harder rhythms. So far we've done four kinds of rhythms. Four kinds of notes, four types of notes. We've done whole notes, which are those circular ones, and they have 4 beats. We say ta, ah. Then you have dotted half notes, which have 3 beats. Ta, ah. You have half notes that have 2 beats, ta, ah. And you have quarter notes that have 1 beat, ta. Now we're going to go into a new type of note called eighth notes. Now an eighth note moves the quickest out of all of those so far. There are notes that do move quicker, but we haven't reached there yet, so don't worry about that. But for now, eighth notes are the quickest moving notes. And they move like this, T-T. So, T-T. Now if we have a beat that's going 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. Our eighth notes will move T, 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 T. Okay? So just remember that for now. We're going to put it into practice so it'll become really easy and you'll never be able to get it wrong. Now I want you to think of this like your shoes. How many shoes do you need to start walking outside? If you only have one shoe, what do you usually tell your parents? Hey mom, dad, have you seen my other shoe? Because you don't just go walking around with one shoe. Now an eighth note is... 1/8 note is called, we say T. Now you'll always be able to know an eighth note because of this little tail. See that little tail right there? That's an eighth note. But there's only one problem, it's alone. It's a single eighth note. So what we're going to be focusing on for now is having a pair of eighth notes, just the same way you have a pair of shoes or a pair of gloves. So if we have 2 eighth notes, we join their tails together at the top, kind of like, here's your tail, here's this other tail, tie it up. And we have a pair of eighth notes, okay? A pair of eighth notes. So the way we say a pair of eighth notes is TT. 1 eighth note would be T, but a pair of eighth notes, TT. All right? So let's just try and put this in practice. At the top over here, you'll see there are a bunch of different eighth notes, and you'll always be able to tell the eighth note because of its joint tails, okay? Now, let's start off by saying the rhythm, okay? This is my beat. My beat will never change, but I will change the rhythm as we read the notes, okay? So this is just going to be clicking in the background. So let's try and read this top line together. Nice and slow. Ta, 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 ti, ti. All right? Notice how that moved twice within one beat. Ti, ti, ta, ta, ta. Let's try read from this first bar to that second bar. 1, 2, 3, go. Ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, ta, ta. One more time. Ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, ta, ta. All right? So it moves twice as quick as any of these quarter notes. This is an eighth note. Because when you put 2 eighths together, you get a quarter. Don't worry about that. That's maths. But for now, I just want you to remember it moves quicker. So now let's try this one. This bar is going to be ti, 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 ta, ta. Ti, 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 ta. Say it with me. Let's go. Ti, 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 ta, ta. Ti, 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 ta, ta. Let's put bar 1 until bar 3 together. 1, 2, 3, go. Ta, 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 ta. Ti, ti, ta, ta, ta. Ti, 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 ta, ta. All right. Not too hard so far. Let's take it all the way to the end. It's to bar 4. Now we have 3 pairs of eighth notes. 1 pair, 2 pair, 3 pair, and then a quarter note. So that's going to be T, 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 ta. T, 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 T. Say it with me. T, 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 ta. T, 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 ta. Now let's try put all of that together. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, 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 ta. Ti, ti, ta, ta, ta. Ti, 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 ta, ta. Ti, 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 ta. All right. Now let's go and put the last bar together. Now all we have in this fifth bar is eighth notes. T, 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 T. All right? That's the whole of the fifth bar. So that's not too hard. Say it with me. T, 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 T. T, 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 T. I want you to notice how we have two eighth notes in every beat, okay? So whenever I click my fingers, which is the beat, we're having two eighth notes like this. T, 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 T. We're not going with every beat. We're not going T, 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 because that would be wrong. We should be saying ta, because ta moves with every beat. But the eighth notes move twice in every beat. So T, 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 T. Say it with me. T, 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 T. All right, so let's look at the difference. Now, before we read the whole thing, I want you to read this first bar and then this second bar, okay? Just so you can see the difference in how they move. So I'm going to show you. In the first bar, if this is my beat, we go ta, 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 ta. But down here, T, 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 T. Ta, 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 ta. T, 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 T. I hope you're seeing that difference of how eighth notes move in comparison to quarter notes. They move twice as quick. Now let's try to put it all together. Bar 1 all the way until bar 5. Ready? Let's go. 1, 2, 3. Say it with me. Ta, 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 ta. T, T, ta, ta, ta. T, 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 ta, ta. T, 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 ta. T, 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 T. All right, that wasn't bad. Now I want you to try and say it for yourself. I'm just going to keep the beat going, and I want you to follow along and read it correctly. Make sure you say the right ta or tt, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, I hope you got that right. If you couldn't get it right that time, just rewind and go back to it. Really easy to get it once you're just able to follow along and see the difference between eighth notes and quarter notes. Now, let's go to our first piece, which is a very famous tune. Everyone in every school, everywhere in the world knows this. It's called Hot Cross Buns. And it goes something like this. Hot cross buns, hot cross buns. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and hot cross buns. All right, sometimes it goes 1 a penny, 2 a penny, hot cross buns. But that's just the general tune. So now let's try and put it on our recorder. It only has 3 notes, G, A's, and B's. But over here we have eighth notes, and we're going to learn how to play that on our recorder. Okay. So let's start this off. These two bars are, these first and second bar and the fourth bar are exactly the same. It's it is B, A, G. B, A, G. And G is held for 2 beats because it's a half note. So let's try that out. B, A, G. All right? So let's play together. 1, 2, 3, go. That's it. Now let's play these two because they're exactly the same, these 2 bars. 1, 2, 3, go. All right. Now let's take it to our third bar, which has our eighth notes. Now our first pair of eighth notes is just G. So we're going to play TT, but on the note G. So let's try that. Follow with me. 3, go. Again. Now let's put 2 pairs of eighth notes together, and they're exactly the same note. G, 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 G. Ready? Go. Go. Now let's go to these last 2 eighth notes, which are still the same as each other, but different from these ones. These ones are A. So we're going to play A in eighth notes. So hold your A, and let's blow. Go. Let's go. Now let's try put our G's and our A's in this third bar together. I'm going to go slowly, then I'll increase the speed. 3, go. One more time, let's go. By yourself, 3, go. One more time, by yourself, let's go. All right, now let's try and put the whole piece up into the third bar together. 1, 2, 3, go. Now, this fourth bar is exactly the same as the first two, so we're just gonna play. Just again, B, A, G. So let's try to put the whole piece. I'll play it with you twice, and the third time, you're gonna play it by yourself. All right, so let's go and get ready. 1, 2, 3, go. Again. By yourself, now go. All right, good work. So hopefully you've been able to get your eighth notes well, and you can see the difference between eighth notes and quarter notes. Eighth notes have this tail, and we're only looking at pairs of eighth notes, so the tails are joined together. And whenever we have an eighth note, we say TT, all right? TT. So go ahead and practice hot cross buns and get really good at it. Be able to play it anywhere all the time. Just don't play too much so people don't get frustrated with the recorder, but have fun with it. And I will see you next week. Good work, grade 2s. See you next week.